Tonight we're going to continue talking about gossip. We missed a week, but we did have one lesson on gossip where we were talking about what gossip is and what it is not. We saw that not every time we talk about someone else is it gossip. It depends on our motivation in doing it and whether we're actually trying to help someone. If there's a real reason for saying what we're saying, and it's an appropriate thing to say. But gossip is a real thing. It's not, we can't just excuse it away saying, oh, well, I didn't mean to do any harm. Most people, although some do intend to do harm, which we'll look at, but most people probably don't intend to do harm through gossip, and yet it does harm. It is a fire from hell, although that's just talking about the tongue in general in James 3, but it is something that gossip is part of. In James chapter 3, in verses 3 through 6, he says, "Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths, that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Look also at ships. Although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. Even so the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and is set on fire by hell." And it's a very impressive way of looking at the tongue. We don't think of the tongue as necessarily something that impressive, and yet it can do an awful lot of damage. And it is something that we have to really watch out for. The power of the tongue is something where James said, see how great a forest a little fire kindles. You don't have to do all the damage through your words. You only have to get it started. And when you think of the tongue, it acts as a deadly poison in a lot of ways. So just like a horse without a bridle, you have the tongue almost having a mind of its own. It's like it wants to do its own thing. And if we're not actively restraining it, then it's going to be destructive. It's going to do things that are going to cause harm. It's something we always have to watch out for, and gossip is just part of that, but it's a big part. So when we look at what is the threat of gossip, why is gossip such a problem? Well, it's not always a lie, as we looked at last time. Sometimes gossip is a lie, but whether it's a lie or not, no matter how truthful it is, it still acts as a deadly poison. It can be weaponized truth, where you have facts being shared with the intent to harm or discredit someone, and not to actually do any good, not to edify. You have malicious nonsense, which is unverified claims that are just shared to cause further controversy. And you have private information, true things, but they do not belong in the context. They were things that were to be kept in confidence, not to be spread around. One of the examples we find is in Acts chapter 14, in verses 1 through 7, when Paul and Barnabas were on their first missionary journey. It says, "Now it happened in Iconium that they went together to the synagogue of the Jews, and so spoke that a great multitude both of the Jews and of the Greeks believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brethren. Therefore they stayed there a long time, speaking boldly in the Lord, who was bearing witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the multitude of the city was divided, part sided with the Jews and part with the apostles. And when a violent attempt was made by both the Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to abuse and stone them, they became aware of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding region. And they were preaching the gospel there." So we have here that the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brethren. And then we find that even though it starts with words, it continues to where there's a violent attempt to abuse and stone them. And so what they were doing, what they were saying was malicious. They wanted to cause harm, poisoning the minds of the Gentiles against the brethren. And this was through slander, or we could say gossip. This is by talking about things that are not true in this case, telling them things, maybe some things that are true without context, and making them think that these are bad people. And it was designed to cause trouble. So the first source of fuel for gossip is malice and conceit. When you have a desire to tear down someone else and build yourself up. So some gossip is born from a desire to harm. So that's the work of the poisoners, as we just read about, those who poisoned the minds. And these are the ones who want to destroy someone's reputation and their influence. And they may even feel justified in doing it. They may think, well, I know this isn't true, but people need to not listen to these people. So it's justified that I tell these things about them. It's evil no matter what the motive is. If they're trying to cause harm and they're poisoning people's minds against someone, that's an evil thing. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, though, we read in verse 13 a different purpose for the gossip. And it says, and besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. So the second source of fuel for gossip is idleness and failure of filtering out what they should or should not be saying. So it's not always mean-spirited. Sometimes it's just the result of an idle mind, which is a result of idle hands. So why do we do it? We share the things just because it's interesting, or we want to fill the silence, we want to kill time. So let's talk about somebody. And the consequence is that it leads to a breach of trust. If you are telling something that's private, it may be true, but it's not to be talked about in this way with these people. And so gossip betrays confidence that's not necessarily out of malice, but they just lack the capacity, not really exactly, but that's how some people seem. They have lost their self-control over their tongue. They have not put a bridle on it. And so they can't hold a secret because they have not been working to control what they're doing and saying. And so this is a fire, as we read about in James. So how does the fire work? Well, if you have conflict and you have a gossip, that fuels the fire. It gives more ammunition to the fight, to the argument. But if you take away the gossip, you have a resolution. The fire dies out. You don't have a continued conflict here. And that's what we read in Proverbs 26, verse 20, where there is no wood, the fire goes out. And where there is no tale-bearer, strife ceases. So you have to have somebody who is continuing to pour on ammunition, fuel for the fire to keep going. There are times when perhaps you see somebody who's having a fight with somebody else, and what comes to mind, because maybe this is your friend, is to start telling them bad things about this person they're already having a conflict with. And it's not really in an effort to help them. It's not really going to do any good here. It's not going to bring a resolution to the problem. And so we have this issue of just pouring on more ammunition or fuel for the fire. And it just causes the argument, the conflict to continue, rather than actually saying, look, here's how you can resolve this. And even though you may know some bad things about the person that they're arguing with, it's not helpful in this situation. So we just keep that to ourselves as we help them come to a resolution. We have some examples in the Bible of this type of thing. We have political sabotage done by Absalom in 2 Samuel 15, where Absalom did not immediately get out the swords. He didn't just go to war against his father David, but he sat at the city gate whispering to the people that King David did not care about justice. But, if only I was appointed judge, then I would give you a resolution to your problem. And so he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And so the kingdom was divided. It was divided by gossip. And this was weaponized to advance his personal power. And then because he had the people behind him, then he went to war. And because God was with David, then David actually won against Absalom even so. But if God was not with him, he was not going to win. That was for sure, because all of Israel mostly was with Absalom because of the gossip he had spread that the people really believed in him rather than in David. Now, if this was a real problem, that David didn't care about justice, that he hadn't anyone who would listen to their problems, then what Absalom should have done was go to his father and say, hey, this is a problem. You need to appoint somebody to listen. But that was not his intent. He didn't actually care about the people. He only cared about influencing them against his father and for him. So that's why he was gossiping. And it wasn't even truthful gossip in that case. In Acts 21, in verse 27 through 29, we see now when the 7 days were almost ended, that Paul was with these men in the temple, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, help! This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people, the law, and this place. And furthermore, he also brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. So what they're saying here is not true, but they think it's true. They have come to this conclusion, and now they just say, this is what's happened. He's brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place, something Paul would never have done. But because they believe bad things about Paul, they're happy to believe anything about him like this. And so he is dragged out and he's going to be beaten to death because of this gossip. This is a false accusation, but I'm sure this wasn't the only one. They're not the only ones who said it. Others who heard it passed it along, right? Oh no, this man's brought Greeks into the temple. He brought Greeks into the temple. And instead of confirming whether that was true or not, they just repeated it. Now, outside the Bible, we have plenty of examples too. One historical case was that Marie Antoinette in 1785. The people already didn't like her. They didn't like having a king or queen over them. And there was a scam where there was a diamond necklace that was stolen through a cardinal who was lied to about the queen wanting it. And then the people that got it sold it off in pieces. But then the gossip went around that the queen was behind it and that she got this really expensive necklace and basically stole it. And that contributed to what people already thought about her. And it made them hate her all the more. And it contributed directly to her being executed later. They cut her head off. And yet she never had that necklace or had anything to do with that whole situation. But most of the country believed she did because of gossip. And it had a huge impact there. So that's political sabotage in more modern times, even though it's a while ago. We have the idea of witch hunts. We've had that in different countries, in England and America, and in our communities here. It still goes on sometimes, where this effect of something being repeated enough. If we just hear it enough, we believe it without seeing any evidence. So If somebody says, hey, this person behaves strangely, we tend to believe it without any proof given. If enough people believe it and say it, well, then it must be true. And so we destroy reputations today by doing that, by just repeating things instead of examining the facts and believing what people are saying without examining the facts. So the problem with just passing along gossip, maybe we're not going to do something about it, right? If we hear somebody's a witch, okay, I don't believe that. I'm not going to do anything about that. But if you pass it along, the person that you're telling may not be that way. They may go out and kill somebody. And that's a real problem. And you have directly contributed to that by repeating something without confirming it or having a good reason to say it in the first place. And so you need to be very, very careful about just passing things along. So the solution, this is similar to what we talked about last time, but this is called the triple filter or the Socrates filter. Socrates was a Greek philosopher a long time ago, but this is something that he taught and others taught as to how do you evaluate whether you should say something. So first of all, is it true? So have I actually verified that this is a true thing? Is it helpful? Does it actually improve the situation if I share this information? And is it necessary? Does this person need to know? Especially if it's private information, we need to really be sure it's necessary that we tell. And so that's the triple filter. First, is it true? Next, is it helpful? Third, is it necessary? And if it passes all of those tests, then we can say it. But that takes self-control. We have to actually be deliberate in how we approach all of this. So we want to be the ones who do that, and we are killing the fire. We're not adding fuel to the fire. And the opposite of gossip isn't just being silent, but somebody who's self-controlled and trustworthy. We're not repeating what is told to us in confidence. We're trustworthy people. And you need to be the one that doesn't pass along gossip. The fire should go out with us. There should be no more fuel for that fire to continue. Whether it's true or not, if it's not a helpful thing to be passed around, it dies with us. And that should be our approach to gossip. It is a real danger, and God hates it. All right, that's the lesson for tonight. Thank you.